So we've looked at some high points of our American progress to extend freedom to all citizens, all times in our country, over our country's history, and it's been an up and down affair. Interestingly, and I think you would agree, at least from what we've been talking about, that the high points of this process have occurred generally in some pretty compressed periods, as revolution or major changes, social, economic, or political, often do. The American Revolution itself lasted about 15 years. There are different estimates probably of when it began and when it didn't, but the First Continental Congress, prior to the war, the outbreak of war in 1774, probably till the inauguration of the first president under the new Constitution in 1789. 15 years, kind of neat. Certainly not a neat process, but from this vantage point, it looks like it had a beginning and an end. The constitutional and the economic revolution of the mid-19th century, which was characterized in our memory from early school days by the Civil War, lasted about 10 years. And we could probably date the beginning of that process. We could go back to 1820, which we did back in February. But really the beginning of the realignment of our political parties back in the late 1850s through the Civil War and the Reconstruction in the late 1860s has often been called that second revolution in our history. It certainly meets the definition of revolution. One whole property system was abolished. There was a nationalizing trend that went through our transportation system, our finance system, the way that we dealt with trade and other things such as that. We had higher hopes. The second Reconstruction then lasted about 5 years. Or excuse me, the first Reconstruction. The second one took 100 years to be born, and it lasted only about 5 years. And I want to focus on that tonight because it may not be well known, but I would date it from the beginning of the March on Washington in 1963 and take us about to 1968. I'm going to try to connect all these eras together in about 5 to 8 minutes, and with a little epilogue. And I hope as I get near the end, I hold it together. First, we need to climb out of the Civil War. So Lincoln promised at Gettysburg in November of 1863 that the principal war aim needed to be changed. And indeed it was. The third resolution of the Republican platform leading up to the election of 1864 resolved that as slavery was the cause and now constitutes the strength of this rebellion, the party demanded its utter and complete extirpation from the soil of the Republic. We had the Emancipation Proclamation, but if the war ended before there was a constitutional amendment protecting that drift, then all would be naught. The war would have been fought, slavery would still exist in the law of the land. And so Lincoln was reelected on that platform, and in January of 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was passed. It was eventually ratified by the requisite number of states in December of 1865. That energy continued in the next several years after Lincoln's death. We had the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, and some of you learn in high school, if they still teach high school history, I don't know. Junior high school? I don't know, somewhere along the way. That the 14th Amendment, which is known today for other things, but it prohibited states from making or enforcing any law which abridged the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States or deprived any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or denied to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. The Equal Protection Clause was written into the Constitution. And the next thing that was needed was the 15th Amendment, which established for all citizens of the United States the right to vote, that it would not be denied or abridged by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. At this point, no reference to sex, national origin, and so forth. So these amendments and what happened with the result of the war probably constituted a triumph for liberty and representative democracy. Certainly, it was an extension of where we were back in the 1770s and 1780s. But amendments need federal law to enable them, to enable the fruits of them to be enjoyed. And that pulse toward liberty and representative democracy didn't last more than a few years and soon eroded after the 1860s. There was a bit of a reprieve in the late 1860s before he became President Grant as Lieutenant General and leader of all the military in the United States. Grant did send troops into the South to ensure that citizenship and equal rights would be pressed, and particularly in the more settled areas of the South. But that pretty much eroded by 1873. And a couple things happened then. My parents lived through the Great Depression. There was a worse depression in the late 19th century. From 1873 to 1893, a 20-year long-range depression that flattened both North and South. There were several panics in that, but that wasn't sufficient. Basically, the amendments were ahead of where the thinking was, mostly in the North and in the South. And particularly with respect to persons of color who might be looking for elective office, government positions, or even just to own their own homes or businesses. And not helping matters were that the Supreme Court, which had been totally reworked in the 1860s, in the later 1870s, had a whole different outlook. It had become conservative again, and they started ruling in ways which will last until the end of the 19th century. One of the first and probably one of the most damning rulings by the Supreme Court in the 1870s was to rule that the 14th Amendment did not apply to people. It applied to state governments. And the case that was brought before them that led to that ruling had to do with the murder of about 100 black persons in Louisiana. The court ruled that they could not be prosecuted. Only the state could have violated the 14th Amendment, and the state was not indictable. So the next time there was, I would say, an extension of freedom as we appreciate it today was when the 19th Amendment was approved and ratified in 1920. The 19th Amendment expanding nationwide suffrage to women, but otherwise civil rights enforcement was basically handed over to the states, and with very rare exceptions from the 1870s until the mid-20th century, the idea of independence that was expressed so memorably in the Declaration had yielded to fear and hate. Now, let's take a giant leap to another era closer to our own. What some historians have called the Second Reconstruction of the 1960s had its roots in a generation who survived the Great Depression, went on to fight for liberty in the most cataclysmic world war of all time. But in that period in the 1940s and 1950s, only a handful of presidential orders and a few Supreme Court rulings were able to weaken resistance, but not to undermine it in the Congress, particularly in the committees in the Congress that were controlled by people who were still clinging to segregation and other measures such as that. I won't go through all of them. There really aren't many of them. Harry Truman in 1948, exasperated because the Congress would not pass the Civil Rights Bill, using his presidential powers, desegregated the armed forces and appointed the first black federal judge federal judge in history in our country. That was in October of 49. Not much to show for almost 100 years. The appointment of Earl Warren as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court by a Republican president, Mr. Eisenhower, led ultimately to a very important court ruling when Earl Warren wrote for the majority in the Brown v. Board of Education case. The ruling affirmed the argument that the defendant and all persons had to, going forward, not tolerate the separation of any race as inferior, and if they had, they would be acting unconstitutionally. And that overturned Jim Crow as we came to know it in the late 19th and for much of the 20th century. And it actually overturned the Dred Scott decision finally, which had led to the Civil War. But that was not enough. In 1957, 9 black children attempted to attend Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, and they were turned away by Governor Orville Faubus, who said integration will not occur in the state of Arkansas. And to his credit, and he had no election to run for at that point, President Eisenhower sent 1,000 paratroopers of the 101st Airborne into Little Rock, Arkansas, federalized the Arkansas National Guard to protect those 9 black students and any others who wanted to attend an all-white high school, thus integrating that high school over the resistance of the governor. It was the first time federal troops were deployed in the South to enforce civil rights since 1873. Eisenhower had a special bond with the 101st. It was just 13 years before that on the eve of D-Day, he showed up at the airfields where the 101st were boarding planes to parachute into occupied France to begin the land campaign to liberate Europe and to bring human rights back to those countries that were then ruled by Germany. Several of those survivors in 1957 were captains and majors and a few colonels in the 101st. Eisenhower wanted to be sure that those 9 students would be protected. He knew. Okay, the second Reconstruction. This is easier. It's only 5 years. I would say that in August 28th to be exact, 1963, our better angels emerged again, and the second Reconstruction began in full. On that day, Martin Luther King, despite a lot of concerns about violence and so forth, led a very peaceful march and found a very peaceful surroundings at the Lincoln Memorial in front of the reflecting pool. And he tapped the American conscience before a very immense crowd at the Lincoln Memorial. He famously stated, "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." He clearly knew, because he was a very practical idealist, that this was not an end but a beginning. He also knew at the beginning of our republic, men dreamed big but failed to include everyone in that dream, limiting liberty largely to white men. He asked in a very inspiring fashion for the expansion of the founder's vision. Nothing more, but surely nothing less. But he also knew he needed help. And now we learn a little bit about what I think is maybe the most remarkable chapters of personal and political courage in our presidential history. On the eve of President Kennedy's funeral, which was just a few months later, Dr. King got a call from President Lyndon Johnson, where he was staying in New York. Now, if you know something about our more recent history, Johnson will forever be remembered for the war in Vietnam. But before that heated up and before it occupied the focus of his presidency, he was all about what he called the Great Society. He was born dirt poor. He had, unlike most presidents, a recognition, despite all the things that he had to go through and the compromises he made, that there was another America, and it was not well served by the law, by the economy, and otherwise. So, partly because of the suddenness of his accession to the presidency and the overwhelming revulsion of most Americans to the violence that happened on November 22nd, 1963, he had an amazing period of time to make some hay, to gain some ground in terms of what that creed of ours promised. And for a few short years, he and Mr. King were a partnership that was unrivaled. On that November evening, it was just, by the way, 100 years after Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, Johnson told King that a draft bill that had been submitted by the Kennedy administration in the fall of '63 in behalf of civil rights would be his top priority. And in collaboration with Dr. King, and I won't go through all the details of it, Johnson was able to sign a landmark Civil Rights Act on July 2nd of 1964, exactly 188 years after the founders' vote for independence on July 2nd, 1776. This comprehensive law finally made it a federal crime to discriminate based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. It also prohibited unequal application of voting registration requirements. It prohibited racial segregation in the schools and public accommodations and employment discrimination. But Johnson and King both, certainly those two, had their sights on something else that Johnson, in his familial way, called the core of the onion, and that was voting rights. Johnson, at that point, knew his advocacy might cost him the '64 election and cost the Democratic Party its dominance in the South. To unconvinced and sometimes hostile crowds on that campaign year, he stated, and this is Johnson in his words, "Should we defeat every enemy, should we double our wealth and conquer the stars and still be unequal to this issue, then we will have failed as a people and as a nation." So the path was not easy. The Voting Rights Act that he and King were behind didn't get passed until August of '65. And before it did, a peak of violence occurred in the South, and those who understand or know something about the civil rights movement in the '60s are well aware of what happened on Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama, when peaceful marchers were moving across the Pettus Bridge, and they were attacked and beaten by the law enforcement that was waiting for them. The images that night on the nightly news enraged Johnson. He called Alabama Governor George Wallace, who was then the staunchest elected advocate for forced segregation. They met in Washington a few days later, and it was a classic Johnson mauling. He put Wallace on one of those soft couches in the Oval Office, and you see them still, and he sat on the high Kennedy rocker, and he leaned in too close for comfort. And he said, "Why don't we go out there in front of those television cameras?" By the way, we know this because Johnson still had the recording devices in the Oval Office, which were removed after his presidency. "Why don't we go out there in front of those cameras right now? Let's announce you've decided to desegregate every school in Alabama." And Wallace kind of meekly responded, "Well, I can't do that. You know, the school's got school boards. They're basically locally run, and I haven't got any power to do that." "Don't bullshit me, George Wallace," he said. And then he went on to describe the Great Society program he had in mind, how it might help him in the South. And he closed by telling Wallace not to think about future elections. He knew that Wallace was interested maybe in running on a Democratic ticket in 1968. He said, George, don't think about 1968. Think about 1988. You and me will be dead and gone. What do you want left when you die? A great big marble monument that reads George Wallace, he built. Or a little piece of scrawny pine that reads George Wallace, he hated. Two days later, on March 15th, Johnson called a joint session of Congress in prime time, and he began. I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy. I urge every member of both parties, Americans of all religions and of all colors, from every section of this country to join me in that cause. At times, history and fate meet at a single time and a single place to shape a turning point in our unending search for freedom. So it was at Lexington and Concord, so it was last week in Selma. Rarely are we met with a challenge not to our growth or welfare or security, but rather to the values and the purposes and the meaning of our nation. The issue of equal rights is such an issue. With a country as with a person, what is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his soul? Many of the issues of civil rights are very complex, but about this there can and should be no argument. Every American citizen must have an equal right to vote. On the night of that speech, after Johnson had returned to the White House, he gets a call from Martin Luther King, who said, "It is ironic, Mr. President, that after a century, a Southern white president would help lead the way toward justice for Black Americans." I'm going to close. So if our brief exploration these last 6 months of our panorama of history have taught us anything, it's that our history is human. It's about imperfect people. We have no lock on what will happen tomorrow any more than those people who voted for American independence back in 1776. But we are the heirs of the first revolution and those who signed their names to the Declaration of Independence in order to explain to the world and for all time what they were doing and why. We are also heirs of what was arguably our second revolution, born of a commitment to contain and then ultimately expunge slavery from the Republic. And we're the heirs of that second Reconstruction I told you about tonight, and a political realignment of the tumultuous 60s that dealt with the heavy residual effects of fear and hate, which had confounded generations of Americans. So what do we do now? While it's true that the rule of law is fundamental to a democracy, the spirit of liberty and equality is still caught in that sense, which begins, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. We is the first word, as it is in our Constitution. That notion binds us, the people, together, for the hope of liberty and equality in this country is more human than we may know. The philosophers of the 18th century, who were the intellectual forebears of the authors of the Declaration, had a phrase for it, a social contract. Since no person has divine authority over any other, and since force creates no right, we are left with arguments, but also agreements, as a basis for all legitimate authority among citizens. So on the eve of the 250th anniversary, what is the social contract between us? What connects us to our creed and our common humanity? The simple truth is that the legacy of freedom is for all of us to live up to. It's an effort that anyone can make. It requires no money, no training. Rising to equality is what Lincoln called it. In the end, John Adams had it right. The real revolution took place in the minds and hearts of the people. Once there, the principles could not be easily dislodged. 200 years ago, as the 50th anniversary of the Declaration approached, there were two surviving authors, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. They exchanged notes and worried that no one who had been present in those tumultuous days of the 1770s could appreciate what had been at stake and the momentous meaning behind their words. Jefferson thought nobody would be able to adequately capture the time's except maybe external facts. But John Adams had a fonder expectation, and he more fully expressed his sentiments in a remarkable letter that he wrote to his wife Abigail on the day that passed between the vote for independence on July 2nd and the adoption of the Declaration on July 4th. On Wednesday, July 3rd, 1776, Adams wrote, "The second day of July," go figure, 1776, "will be the most memorable day in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as a great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as a day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore. You will think me transported with enthusiasm, but I am not. I am well aware of the toll and blood and treasure that it will cost us to maintain this declaration and support and defend these states. Yet through all the gloom, I see the rays of ravishing light and glory. I can see that the end is more than worth all the means, and that posterity will triumph in that day's transaction." Happy 4th.